Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to introduce Ilse Heremans. Ilse is working as a UX expert at KBC. She's going to talk about accessibility, something often credited to designers, but she will try to convince us that it's also something that developers should be aware of. So I can give the floor to Ilse.
Okay, thank you, Lode. So, as Lode already said, I'm Ilse, working at KBC, wearing glasses, important to know, and looking at the color of my hair, I also passed already the age of 40. You'll know right away why I'm telling you this. Talking about accessibility. In the past, accessibility was quite important in our physical branches. We had these specific parking lots for people in a wheelchair. We even have, looking at a sign up front of the branch, telling that everybody is welcome. But yeah, nowadays, we should wonder how accessible is our biggest branch for the moment, our mobile branch. And that's something we have been researching the past few years, also trying to improve. And that's also why I'm here, because if you think about accessibility, yeah, the first thing that comes in mind is, yeah, it's about people with disabilities. And of course, one of the first items is people with disabilities. You have physical disabilities, you might be in a wheelchair, you might have broken your arm, you might be paralyzed. Then you have the visual impairments. I see quite some men in the room. Maybe some of you is colorblind, because 8% of men is colorblind. That's a fact. Then we have the visual impairs. I have glasses. I see also other people with glasses. And then, of course, in Belgium, we have about 10,000 blind people. If you calculate that maybe 1/5 of them is, or maybe 1/10, let's say like that, is client at KBC, it means that we still have 1,000 blind clients at KBC. That's quite an important number. Then you have restrictions on cognitive and neurological level. Think of attention disorders, dyslexia, and so on. I have 2 sons at home who are dyslexic. They don't have actual problems, but you notice sometimes while reading that they have some issues. And then, of course, you have the hearing and speech disorders. But yeah, these are people with disabilities. But looking at the room, you're all quite young, I think. But once you pass the age of 40, you will notice that your hearing gets less good, your vision deteriorates, and your joints get less flexible. Maybe some already are already facing it. But yeah, it's a fact that about almost 20% of the Belgian population is older than 65. So this means that our group that we assumed was quite small is becoming bigger and bigger. Even if you think about the previous slide, there is said that about 15% of world population has some kind of disability. 15%, that's 15 out of 100, that's quite a large group. Also calculates everybody older than 65. And in the end, everybody will face some kind of disability depending on certain situations. If you are in the shopping mall, in the supermarket, queuing, maybe with some groceries in one arm, trying to check your balance in your other arm, this means that you only have one hand to check your mobile phone. If you're outside and the sun is shining and you're trying to look at your screen, it might be that the sun is making it difficult for you to see the screen clearly. If you're in a train station and a train is arriving, and at that moment you're trying to do a phone call, you might not be able to hear the other one on the phone. And maybe if you're on vacation and trying to express yourself in another language, it might be that the other people don't understand what you're trying to say. So in the end, we started thinking that it was only a small group of people where accessibility was important for. If we now think at this slide, then you will notice that in the end, everybody will benefit from accessibility improvements that we're doing. And why do we need to do these improvements? Of course, you have the users, the group we just explained. But you also have the fact that for the moment, inclusion is getting very important in companies. I think that, for instance, Microsoft recently announced their new director, where I think inclusion was one of their focus points. You have corporate sustainability, certainly in big companies like KBC, that's quite important. Of course, as a financial institution, you also have your role in society. At KBC, we have SERA. It's part of KBC, or KBC is part of SERA. Can't explain it clearly. And then, of course, there is legislation. We already have an anti-discrimination law in place. You probably regularly hear about UNIA in the news, where some issues were filed. That's something that is already in place. But keep in mind that mid-2025, we also will have the EU Accessibility Act that will become in place. It was voted in 2019. Normally, this year, Belgium had to create this national translation of this law somewhere by June, but I think Belgium is late, as usually. But keep in mind that all commercial companies should be accessible, digitally accessible, by mid-2025. So we only have a couple of years left to become fully accessible. Thinking about banking, this doesn't just mean that our apps should be accessible and our website should be accessible. We also have to think about vending machines and so on. So it's more than just the things we think about right away. Now, if you think about requirements and what will this law be based on, we have to refer to the WCAG guidelines. Maybe some of you already heard about it. Maybe some of you are front-end developers, I don't know. Some, at least. Okay, so then you probably will know about it. These are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. For the moment, it's version 2.1, but I know that there is a version 2.2 in draft. So they're working on a new version. And it contains guidelines to work accessible. It's based on 4 principles, the POUR, as we say it. So it should be perceivable. You should be able to consult information, and if you can't read it, at least you should be able to hear it, for instance. It should be operable, so you should be able to use it or know how to use it. It should be understandable, so the content should be clear. And it should also be robust. So it means that it should be usable, for instance, with extra assistive technologies. You have the braille readers, the screen readers, and so on. For the moment, as I said, WCAG 2.1 is the active one. 2.2 is in draft. And then you have different levels of severity. Level A is the least severe, and then level AAA is the most severe. For the governmental organizations, it's level AA, so AAA, and we assume that also for commercial organizations, it will become the same. So if you take a look at the WCAG guidelines, level AA, that's normally the guidance that we are giving towards our colleagues where we should take account into. Also, these guidelines, even though they're put web between brackets, are mostly written for web creation, HTML, but they also apply for native development, so for the web applications. For me, and maybe that's the thing that Lode was referring to, accessibility has different aspects. You have the technical part, the visual part, and the content part. So the technical part, to my opinion, is most important for you. Of course, code should be written correctly in order that screen readers are able to read out loud the content correctly. For instance, semantics should be correct. We see a screen real estate on a page, on a website or whatever. We see headings, titles, subtitles, and whatever. The same information should be conveyed in the code. So using heading 1, heading 2, whatever, to make it clear. So for a blind user, the usage of heading and coding is the same as what we see on a screen with titles, subtitles, and whatever. Also, thinking out further, buttons should be defined as buttons, so that at least the functionality of a button is also explained by a screen reader. You should have labels that being read out loud. I can give an example. I can't say that it wasn't KBC related, but at a certain moment, we read it out loud with voiceover, button, button, button. Now, I don't know if you understand, but something that only tells out loud button, button, button doesn't say anything. So that should be clear as well. And of course, correct reading order is also very important. The same as tab functionality. You should be able to navigate without a mouse, for instance. So I think that's your responsibility. Then the visual part is rather Ruben's responsibility, maybe other UX colleagues over here. That's rather related to color. It isn't all about blind users, also people who have a less good view or maybe badly sighted. They also should be able to perceive the colors correctly. So this means that the contrast ratio between text and background should be clear enough. Also, this is defined in these WCAG guidelines. Sorry, I'm talking really too fast. It even says, and I think even if you look for it, color contrast ratio checker online, you can quickly enter your hexadecimal color codes, and then you will see if those colors have enough contrast ratio or not. It's mostly to have contrast, for instance, when you're out of the sun, seeing something in light pink on a white background, you probably won't be able to read it. What's also important related to the visual part is also that, for instance, in graphs, when we use different colors, for colorblind, we should give more than just a color to distinguish between different bars or graphs in the item. So things might look or might have the same color for someone who is colorblind. So it's better, for instance, to combine it with a raster or some lines or whatever. And then, of course, yeah, it should be readable, so fonts should be big enough. Maybe that's also a bit part in relation to the semantics and the code, because when it's about app development, then you should also check a dynamic type and see if your font size also changes with the settings of your device. And then the content part is rather for the copywriters. Copy should be clear enough, written clearly, so that also my sons with dyslexia, oh Jesus, I also have issues with dyslexia, can understand what's written. And of course, those content creators also need to provide the textual alternatives, for instance, for images, graphs, infographics, and so on. This also means that you as developers need to provide these alt attributes on the images. And even if it is just a decorative image, you also have to provide the alt attribute, but it can remain empty. I see people nodding, so it means that it's known. I'm happy. How are people using a computer when they have a disability? You probably know them, the screen readers. So it's a piece of software that reads out loud all content on the screen. JAWS is normally the tool that is being used mostly. It is a paying tool, so it means that it's quite costly. I think it's a couple of €1,000. You also have free versions, and for instance on Mac you have a voiceover functionality, but I was told that normally JAWS is used by most of our blind Belgians, and VDA is an alternative. It seems that voiceover on Mac is quite difficult. Then you have Braille display, so it reads out loud everything towards Braille. You have, for people who still are able to see but might have a bad vision, they can use magnification software. And then, yeah, you probably all know Stephen Hawking. If you can't use the mouse or whatever, you have alternative input devices. Now, a smartphone. I guess you all have a smartphone with you. It also has built-in accessibility features, and quite good. Even though I was told that in Belgium, blind users mostly use an iPhone, it's probably because Apple has been working on accessibility already for years. Android is somehow fetching up, but a bit later. About 99% of the blind Belgian community is using iPhone, but this doesn't mean that you should forget about Android, because to my opinion, someone who becomes blind later in life because of an accident or whatever, who has been using Android already for years, he probably will continue or remain using Android because he knows the system, he knows the gestures, the patterns, and so on. So you shouldn't just ignore Android. And of course, we had a talk with the accessibility lead of Spotify last year. And we more or less asking the same question, how important is Android for you? And there the answer was quite clear. Yeah, Spotify is universal. Generally, Android is being sold more as it's just cheaper. And Android has a broader market. So that was also, for me, it was an eye-opener. So I don't know if you use this function, but for instance, I passed the age of 40. I already have changed my text size on my iPhone to make it easier. This just avoids me having to have... I guess some people recognize it. Sometimes when you're outside and you see people really trying to read what's on their phone and think, okay, please change your settings. You have a zoom functionality where you just can zoom in on certain regions on your iPhone. I, for instance, just 3 taps and I have a part on my screen that's zoomed in. And then, of course, VoiceOver. For me, VoiceOver is the most important one because it also implies that we have to check applications for VoiceOver, see if it works correctly, because what does VoiceOver do? I'll explain in a slide a bit later on, but it reads out loud all information on your screen. It also gives extra information. For instance, when you press a button, it also says back button, so that the user who hears it also knows, okay, it has a functionality. I can tap twice in order to activate the button. Also, headings are being read out like, this is the title, heading, to make clear for the user that he's passing a heading. So more or less translating the visual style towards the vocal information. Now, maybe some of you are wondering if this is used a lot, these accessibility settings on your iPhone or your I think it's called accessibility settings. This is a research done in the Netherlands. I think it was only done on iPhone, but I assume we can generalize it. It was about 1.5 million Dutch users, so I think significance is reached. And I think they just measured the accessibility settings on the iPhone. It was in relation to one application, I don't know which it was. But if you look at the numbers, about 1/3 is changing font size. So that's quite a lot. So this means that dynamic type, adjustable font sizes in your applications are quite important. Also dark modus, 26-27%, is also quite an important feature. So thinking that it isn't useful, here we see the proof that we have users who are using it. Now, I see some phones lying over here. Maybe we can do a test and see if you can find the accessibility settings in your phone. I'm experienced with iPhone, so maybe the ones in Android can help themselves. I think you also have some kind of settings in Android. Okay, well, you have to look for the instellingen or settings. You can easily put it on. I even have an extra functionality on my phone. I put it behind my home button, so I only have to click twice, and I'll put my sound. I hope you can hear it. So I can swipe through my screen. So it really reads out loud all the information. If I want to use the functionality, I have to double tap. So in this case, I'm going to the settings of my Bluetooth. And you can easily swipe through your screen. If you swipe right, you go forward. If you swipe back or left, you go backwards. You also have a functionality, it's called a rotor. I don't know how it is on Android, where you can change settings. It's probably not really clear, but for instance, what I often use is headings. And these headings makes it possible to swipe from one heading to the other heading. So it means that you don't have to swipe through all information to fetch what you're looking for or to find what you're looking for. You can easily shift between headings in order to find the section you're looking for. So I would suggest also to add this functionality behind your home button. I know on Android somewhere you can also access the accessibility settings somewhere in the right lower corner. So when you're developing, just test it now and then, and I think that's the most important one. These are just explained. So in relation to development, I'm not the expert over here, it's you, so I can just explain what I experienced, what I noticed the last few years, which issues appeared quite often. I think the first one, use the correct base language. You have to test it, but hearing a voice read out loud Dutch with an English accent, you can't understand it. So just a simple thing, we tend to forget it sometimes, so just set the base language correctly, but it's quite important. As I said before, the semantics, already said it in the 3 aspects slide already. Make sure that you use the correct headings, that you don't jump from a heading 1 towards a heading 4. It's quite confusing for a blind user, so just check it and see if it's correct. Of course, when it's related to content, it might also be that you need to guide the content creator or the web author who's entering the content, because often those are the users who also tend to assign the headings. And if they don't know how to create these headings, they might make mistakes. They often just look at how it looks like on screen, and they don't think about the correct semantics of the headings. Logical tab order. I hope that it's maybe part of your definition of done, but it's just a simple thing, tabbing through your page to see if it has a logical order, and you just easily swipe or go through your page. Yeah, you should be able to use your pages without a mouse. So just again, use your tab, use your enter key, see if it works. Also, if possible, but that's related to design, provide a visible focus style for your interactive elements. So at least that you see what is the active element at that moment. And when you're tabbing through your site or a web page, that at least you know where you are with your tab. Make sure that label and form elements are linked. I think, somewhere has to do with an ID. The rest I don't remember, but I guess you know better than I do. The alt text, we already discussed this before. And I also advise to open links in the same browser tab. If you're blind, you even don't notice that something is being opened in a new browser tab. You just jump towards the new browser tab, but at a certain moment, this user will notice that his back button won't work anymore. So that's why I advise to open links in the same browser tab. If a user really wants to open something in a new browser tab, he probably will go for right mouse, open a new tab, and he'll do it that way. I see someone doubting.
Depending if it's within the context of your own website, or if it's another one, an external website, you might lose the customer and you don't.
In that case, I would suggest to somehow give this information, like opening in a new tab or whatever, to make it clear that he's going to a new browser tab. At least then, managing expectations, that he knows what's happening. And
Is that not a requirement in the WCAG?
I think it's not. I don't think it's a specific requirement. It could be, but it isn't that we just can say you can't open a link in a new tab. I think it says like it's advisable to open it in the same tab. I remember having discussions about this with Rul van Geels and Bart Simons from AnySurfer. I don't think that's a rule that is really built or set in stone, but I would just advise it to do so. And for me, it's more or less Chinese, but make sure you apply the correct area roles and attributes. In C, I think it's best to go for real HTML code, so define a button as a button, but if it isn't possible, make sure that you foresee the correct alternatives. Now, in relation to native apps, I think the rules are more or less the same. Of course, it's another code to create it, so maybe there is a difference. I never worked on apps from the code side in the far past, I created websites in HTML, but that's about 20 years ago. So we even created a website in tabs that time, so quite long ago. At a certain moment, I stopped with HTML. But in relation to native apps, make sure that you define a button as a button, so it also has this functional information, and make sure that the label is being read out clearly. If certain labels are too general, for instance, new, we have such a functionality in our mobile app at KBC, maybe you can also provide a specific voiceover label. I think we had a label called new, and we made it open new current account, for instance, to really make it clear what's behind the button. Also, the same as for HTML, make sure that you have the correct reading order. So when you swipe through your elements, that it's quite logical that you don't jump from the upper screen towards the bottom of your screen and then up again. Also foresee headings, I'm going too far, to make it possible to, using the rotor, as I just explained before, so you can really jump between headings to find the information you're looking for. And then, of course, in overlays, that's something that's going wrong sometimes. Make sure that the voiceover remains in this overlay. Somehow it tends to jump behind it and also starts reading out information behind the overlay. And then, of course, alerts and error messages need to be defined as an alert. So in order that people who don't see the message at least hear the message. Okay, and yeah, most important, also for you, test, test, test. I think that's maybe my main message I want to give over here is, just if you have testing devices or whatever, just put them next to you, install your accept version or whatever, and just set up VoiceOver, go through it and see, okay, is it clear, and continue. Because I have the feeling that sometimes we tend to test too much once it's really in the testing phase, but then it means that when something needs to be solved, you have to open your code again, you have to start looking for the error, start changing, retesting, and so on. So for testing, you probably know it better than I do. You have Google Lighthouse, you have developer tools, you can just have the add-ons in your browser, so that's the first part. But of course, accessibility testing isn't really an exact science. So part of it can be exact, checking if alt texts are present or are being filled in. But the content of this alt information, that's something that somehow interpretation is needed. You need to understand what it's about, what is in the image, what is the message we want to convey. So it means that manual testing is also very important. As I just said before, you can easily test using VoiceOver or talkback on your smartphone. You can maybe try JAWS on your Windows device. I know that JAWS, it is a paying tool, but you can install a test version and use it for 40 minutes. Afterwards, you have to reboot your computer, but at least you had 40 minutes to test it. If you just want to check things easily, quickly, then it might be an issue or a solution. NVDA is a free tool, so you can also try that one. Or you can also try VoiceOver on your MacBook. And yeah, don't forget to test with your tab. It's quite simple, easy, but somehow we tend to forget it. And at KBC, because I'm working at KBC, I think it's quite a logical slide over here, because it's not just related to accessibility, it's related to everyone. User research, user testing, and so on. Start with it as soon as possible, rather in the service design phase, analysis phase. Don't wait with it until at the end, because if serious issues appear at the end, then it means that it's a costly thing to get it fixed. I think this information related to this 16 to 20% extra cost was information we got from the VRT. They have a department really focused on accessibility. And I think, and maybe some football fans over here in the room, they created the Sportsa football app. with really a focus on accessibility. So if you want to know an example where it's been done very, very good, I think they even have systems to how do you say it in English, the team opstelling, team settings, I don't know how to say it in English. It even is being read out clearly who is where in the field. So let's try it if you feel so. It's what else are we doing at KBC? We're embedding accessibility in our project lifecycle. So really also adding it in a milestone. So then when it's about budgets, that at least there is an item somewhere in the slide that says accessibility is taken into account. So we don't forget about it, because somehow accessibility is something that is being forgotten very easily. We have measure points that need to be included so that we can track data and whatever. We're a data-driven company. That's something that we don't seem to forget, but accessibility we seem to forget. So that's quite an important one. We're trying to create awareness within the company so that at least our colleagues know why we are doing it, who we are doing it for. So it's awareness sessions, explaining about accessibility. We also have a working group that's called Diversity Rocks. It's a bit broader than just disabilities. It's also gender and whatever. But also there we tend to organize sessions in relation, for instance, disabilities. We have a session planned, I think, later this year, where we do some kind of dare to ask, where we invite some colleagues who have a disability, visible and non-visible, to also explain how it is working at KBC with a disability. So it also tends to change the mindset of some of our colleagues. We provide technical trainings. This is mostly in collaboration with AnySurfer, Rolf van Giels from 11 Ways. We have some kind of, or they created some kind of joint venture where AnySurfer is present, 11 Ways is present. I think also the company from Verfeyen, they're all related to AnySurfer, or they used to work at AnySurfer at certain moments in their lives, but they're all experts in relation to accessibility. So also for me, if we have certain specific questions where I can't really answer or just think, okay, what would be the best option to do, then I often consult them and they give me advice, because they're really doing accessibility from morning to evening. Bart Simons himself is blind as well, so he also has the experience as a user from the other side. And what we're also doing is that we're involving clients with a disability in our user research, in our testing. We even have an ex-colleague who became blind during his career. Now he's retired, but he's really giving useful information. We can ask him questions, we can ask him to test certain things, and we're trying to broaden this user group so that we can have things tested before we go to production. Because it's quite confusing, or rather frustrating, for someone with a disability to notice that somehow he isn't able, for instance, an example we had, I think, a couple of years ago, he isn't able to see the amounts of his investments in the application because we have an accessibility issue. That's something that, if a sighted user can't see how much his investments are worth, maybe now isn't the right time to check those, but then it would be frustrated and probably, het kot zou te klein zijn. I don't know how to say it in English. But I think we should consider the same, that for a person with a disability, it should be clear either. So I think that's more or less what I wanted to tell today. So keep in mind, and also take that along if possible, what we do better for people with disabilities. In the end, we do better for everyone. And I think that's most important. Think of yourself when you're outside in the sun trying to read your smartphone, or maybe look at Facebook or whatever. So that's the most important one. Broaden the story. If you're somewhere in a project, in a team, also mention this to your team colleagues. Okay, think about accessibility. Keep in mind that it's becoming obligatory, so there is a law coming up. And that's more or less my story for today. So I hope it was interesting. If you have questions, I don't know how much time there is left.
some time left.
Okay, still some time left, so if you have questions, Ruben?
I've got one. Quite interesting for website and app that you can do all those things, but like you said, and it's quite interesting, KBC is also, for example, terminals and other kind of things, and that's quite in a public space. How do you do that, for example, with people with disabilities? Are you also...
Well, that's an issue that recently we noticed. You probably already heard about Batopin cash points. So quite a couple of big Belgian banks, KBC is one of them, decided to collaborate for their vending machines. So they're creating these cash points. They are accessible. They are foreseen with a jack, how do you say it, to enter a headphone for speech communication. But of course, the downer side of it is that, yeah, they aren't in a branch, so there is nobody to help them. So I have to think. So it's foreseen. There has been tested on, but it's not ideal, I must be honest. Sorry, I've been talking too loud. Someone else had a question?
Yeah, so I hope I'm talking loud enough, but...
Yeah, it's clear.
Right now I'm working at a client which is a part of a pretty big enterprise. I'm gonna keep them anonymous for now. But I've noticed that as a developer, I've had some friction when I tried to push some accessibility rules. Like, for example, recently they wanted to introduce a search bar that required you to click first on a button to then open a field.
Yeah.
And when I told them that, hey, we should definitely check, or maybe include in the acceptance criteria that we should check for accessibility, it was kind of met with like some uncertainty or some friction. Do you have any, I don't know, like maybe some kind of motivations that we can give that this is a very important thing to accentuate?
I think if you start with saying that it will become legally obliged, then they're probably already... I can't say what the measures or punishments will be when we don't apply. It won't be like GDPR, where somehow huge fines are hanging, but maybe that's the start. And also, yeah, make clear that quite some users do have a disability, so if they can't work at it, I even think that in the States there was a case where a blind user wasn't able to order his pizza with Domino's online. And I think he got a couple of million as a compensation. So maybe also give that as an example. It's quite extreme, but...
But does it also apply if you only work B2B?
It's less, but companies, I think, should also be inclusive when it's about employees and whatever. So,
but if the company does not need to follow those rules, they won't.
It will be more difficult. Yeah, I'm honest. Yes?
Isn't it hard inside of the KBC because like it's bank details, and as a client or someone who has a need of voiceover, I wouldn't want to like be in public and have the app reading out my balance like minus 500.
Yeah. What these blind users often do, they use ears. So, for instance, when I met Bart Simons, who is blind himself, he uses an app to guide him through the city to find the ways towards his home. He's just putting in one side of his earphones to avoid probably the two sides. It's also taking out the noise from the environment, so that's not ideal either. And I also assume that blind users, they're quite sensitive or strict in using financial data on the go. They probably will consult their information at home when they're in an environment that is safe. I even have an example of a blind client where somehow the colleagues of the branch created a specific debit card for him so that he could only withdraw cash in the vending machine of that branch so that he wouldn't be able to withdraw it on another location where someone else could be looking over his shoulder, entering a code, because he doesn't know who's standing behind him and who's looking at the screen. So people tend to be how you say it, veilig?
Careful.
Yeah, careful with this idea.
Is it that obliged to build in a system? Like, let's say you want to consult your balance, but does it like need to ask again, or do you want to have your balance read out?
I think that's not really necessary, and also related to the codes and the secure information, they often use a fingerprint. I noticed that blind users or blind clients, they prefer these iPhone versions where you have this home button below, because probably it's easy also for fingerprint ID, because probably Face ID is also less difficult to use because you really have to position it correctly. Yeah.
So, so the EU is telling states you need to be compliant with rules and this and that. But to be honest, I've only heard this from consultants like you, people who are in the space, who know that this will be a requirement by 2025. But what is the EU doing itself to promote this? Like, I haven't seen any commercials yet. Or, how does the EU want to create awareness about this?
Well, I have no clue, to be honest. I must say that it's a fact. I do remember that I think somewhere on Studio Brussel, I don't know, I hear sometimes these advertising related to EU and it's a Dutch accent that I really think, okay, what is this? Couldn't they also foresee someone else in Flemish to also create that advertising? But specifically related to accessibility, I don't think that the EU is really investing a lot. They have these working groups, but really making it clear to the outside that there is this obligation coming up.
Yeah, it's a bit double up because they say, okay, it's going to be a legal requirement by 2025, but nobody knows.
Yeah, and
They were really active.
Yeah, I don't really know where the difference is or the balance between GDPR. We had really a huge fuss. While now accessibility, we know that it's coming up, but there is no fuss. It's just the experts who know what's coming up, and probably, or I assume, and maybe we also had that with GDPR, probably within a year or within 2 years, just before we have to comply, probably at that moment something will happen. I don't know how it's been done with the governmental organizations, because they already need to be accessible. I also assume that there are a lot of changes were done towards the final deadline.
But what I always thought was that we were going to move to a more plain HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and that they would let the browsers and the systems like iOS, Android, and whatever take up the accessibility, usability part, meaning they would rely less and less on developers themselves to do those things and rely on the big guys. Because the WCAG guidelines, for example, those are done, for example, from parts of the big guys, the Apples, the Amazons, the Googles. So in that case, it would be less and less our responsibility to do those things and let it up to them. What's your take on that?
To my opinion, but maybe that's just with my background, for me, correct HTML is accessible HTML. Semantics, to my opinion, it just inherits towards HTML, and even without the thing, it should be accessible. To my opinion, semantic code in the end is accessible. But I'm honest, I'm not an expert in HTML or whatever, so maybe it's a discussion we need to have with the colleagues over here, or maybe someone else has an idea on this.
The thing is that with the given frameworks, there's less focus on semantics in HTML.
Yeah.
Because you can, from the basics, you can achieve everything with a div and span.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And then you get these angular things where somehow
What's that?
the tab functionality doesn't work, or you can't enter something even though it's clickable or should be clickable, and yeah.
I think as like a little input on what Bart said, I think it will always also be a responsibility for both the developer, but if browsers themselves will also start implementing more accessibility rules by themselves, then I can only see it as an improvement, but not a takeaway from our responsibility as a developer ourselves. Because you can have too little accessibility, but it's very hard to maintain too much accessibility. So it's better to have both parties being responsible for their end than to have one party being lackluster in one and having lesser accessibility because of it. That makes sense.
So it's a shared responsibility.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not because one starts getting more accessible that the other needs to let loose.
Yeah, just let go. Yeah, yeah.
I would also not trust the giants too much on this, like Apple and Google, because yeah, they have been very keen on, like Apple, yeah, we're only going to allow quality in the App Store, but there's so much scams going on in the App Store that, yeah, that statement is actually just bullshit.
Yeah.
So yeah, it needs to be a shared responsibility, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. I think then we're finished. I hope it was interesting. Okay. You're welcome.